Just after 4 p.m. one December afternoon in 1987, a Melbourne office block became a scene of carnage.
In all my years of policing and as a detective, this is absolutely the worst crime scene I ever saw.
Relatives of the victims had to be restrained by police as they raced to the scene.
Innocent office workers found themselves caught up in a terrifying ordeal as they witnessed friends and colleagues being killed in front of them.
I never believed you could smell fear. He absolutely stank.
He just walked over and held the gun barrel about an inch away from Michael's scalp and shot him again.
The man at the centre of the chaos was a young student whose pent-up anger and frustration would lead to a tragic outcome.
He was a volcano waiting to erupt. He was a time bomb waiting to go off, and it went off on December the 8th, 1987.
There's a truck coming out of the building with a dead man, looks like on the footpath, and I'm not quite sure. It's right in front of me, please.
The cold-blooded massacre that took place in Queen Street in central Melbourne was a crime that shook Australia.
Queen Street's predominantly one of the busiest streets of Melbourne. So you got hustle bustle day and night from really 8 a.m. until 8 p.m, people moving about.
The Queen Street area of Melbourne in the 1980s was part of the Central Business District, and it still is to this day.
Very commercial, lots of national businesses have their headquarters there, lots of restaurants, coffee shops to feed the office workers.
Now it's a major city hotel, but in 1987, the building at 191 Queen Street was home to several large businesses, including the national headquarters for Australia Post.
They had several floors. It was also the headquarters of the Telecom Employees Credit Union, which was on the 5th floor. There was also a number of other offices. There was about between 850 and 1,000 people who worked in that building. 18 stories high, on the corner of Littleburg and Queen Street.
On December the 8th, 1987, staff in the building on Queen Street were going about their daily business.
We were on the 11th floor. It was an open plan building, and in those days you could walk in and you could go to any floor you liked. There was some security on some floors, like there was the Telecom Credit Union on the 5th floor, which had obviously some security. December the 8th for me was a busy working day. Nothing out of the ordinary, but it was a very busy day. It was obviously close to Christmas, and we were wrapping up the financial reporting for the previous month.
I worked on the 11th floor in Queen Street, Australia Post, in the revenue and expenditure area, revenue and accounting area.
I worked on the 14th floor of the Australia Post building. I knew all of the people by name on our floor, but Australia Post had maybe 14 or 15 floors. You knew a lot of people to nod to or to say g'day to in the lift.
Also that morning, inside his home in the quiet suburb of Preston, 10 kilometres north of Melbourne, a young student by the name of Frank Vitkovic was preparing for the day ahead.
Frank Vitkovic was 22 years old, single, lived at home with his mum and dad. His father came from Yugoslavia, his mum was Italian. They both emigrated to Melbourne in the 60s, had 2 children. Lily, Frank's older sister, she was about 3 years older than him. He still lived at home at the time.
Frank Vitkovic was a good guy, as I knew him. He was pretty intense. He kept to himself a lot. He was intense and he loved his tennis. He was passionate about his tennis.
The young Frank Vitkovic had a troubled childhood and was often bullied at school.
He needed to go to the toilet when I was at church mass one day, and the teacher wouldn't let him. And he wet his pants, basically, and was then had to go back to the classroom and was told to sit elsewhere because, you know, he was obviously a bit smelly. And his classmates, boys being boys, embarrassed him and talked about that and laughed at him. He then talks about shortly after that incident, he was actually naked in the changing rooms after sport when one of the boys noticed that his penis was different to the others. In Australia, it's quite common for boys to be circumcised. Vitkovic wasn't, which meant that his penis was different to theirs.
This sense of being different would come to characterise his early life.
Frank Vitkovic was very isolated and depressed, and I think he spent a lot of time ruminating about these things, about things that people had said or done or treated him badly and so on. And as he ruminated, as he went over and over these things in his mind, they took on bigger and bigger and bigger proportions until they led to this obsessional need for revenge.
However, this anger and bitterness didn't hamper his studies, and he gained a place at the prestigious Melbourne University Law School. Soon, though, Vitkovic's education began to be affected by a sense that he was being marginalised by society.
While I was at university, he had to prepare an essay, and his lecturer, when he read that essay, became very concerned about Vitkovic's state of mind, in that it was completely bizarre and off-topic, including at one stage he talked about how vital it was that all civil libertarians should be shot dead. That lecturer then told the counsellor at the university, and two appointments were made in December 86, sort of 12 months before the actual incident. And he had quite long conversations with that counsellor where he talked about he'd had suicidal thoughts.
I think Frank Vitkovic had built up a hostility towards the world in general. He felt the world in general had given him a raw deal and was treating him badly. So it wasn't simply about revenge against one person or a small group of individuals. He really wanted to get his own back on the world that he saw as having treated him so badly.
Good morning. It looks like been a good day too, particularly weather-wise. Some sunny periods, dry, mild, around about 21 degrees, and weather like that for the next couple of days, even into the mid-20s by the start of the weekend.
On the morning of December 8, 1987, Frank Vitkovic woke and prepared for what he called his mission. He got a bag out, he put a change of clothing in there, he put binoculars in there, he put a knife in there, he put a sawn-off M1 carbine automatic rifle in there, and at least 200, possibly 300 rounds of ammunition. Made a final entry in the diary that he had been keeping for a number of years. And the final entry was basically, today's the day I'm going to do it, and headed off on a tram to Melbourne University, where he went straight to see Mary Cook, who was a woman who worked at the reception area, who he'd become friendly with during his time there as a student. He went to the counter. She was concerned about his state. He was not looking as smart as he normally was, and she said, "Anything wrong?" And he said, "Yes, I've failed 3 subjects and I've deferred for a year." And she said, "Oh, you know, is there anything I can do to help? I can get you to see a counsellor if you like." Frank turned to her and said, "I'm sorry, I can't. I've got a job to do at the post office."
A few hours later, Vitkovic and 8 others would be dead, and the city of Melbourne would be changed forever. On the 8th of December 1987, a young man boarded a tram in suburban Preston and headed into Melbourne. His name was Frank Vitkovic, and within just a few hours, he and 8 innocent people would be dead. One of the last things Vitkovic did before leaving home that morning was to make a final entry into his diary, where, in plain, simple language, he told the world what he was about to do.
He talked about his troubled mind, about how he couldn't help himself, that he knew one day he was going to do something really violent and that he was going to kill people. It was a gradual build-up. He was a volcano waiting to erupt. He was a time bomb waiting to go off. And it went off on December the 8th, 1987.
Inexplicably, in his own mind, Vitkovic had channeled all his anger onto one man, a man he believed was somehow responsible for all his problems. This unsuspecting individual was his former friend and tennis partner, Con Margelis.
Frank Vitkovic and Con Margellis had known each other since primary school. They went to the same primary school, the same secondary school. Con was one of Frank's few friends. He didn't have many friends. That relationship soured when, in late 84, early 85, Frank damaged his knee whilst out jogging.
I remember that he was injured and it frustrated him because he wanted to play tennis. He couldn't play A, to the level that he wanted to, and B, as much as he wanted to.
Con, in Frank's mind, wasn't as supportive as he should have been. In fact, he used to laugh at the fact that Frank was no longer as fit, and Frank started putting on a bit of weight and getting chubby. And in Frank's mind, Con was not a true friend, and that was basically the start of the troubles between them. Very strong friendship for a number of years fell out over the knee.
On that December afternoon, Vitkovic had made up his mind that Con had to pay for his supposed betrayal of their friendship.
Frank made his way to 191 Queen Street, entered at the ground floor at about the 4 o'clock mark. He was seen on the 9th floor, around about 4:05, carrying a bag. He then went at 4:16, and we know that because of the CCTV footage, to the counter of the Telecom Employees Credit Union. He stood patiently at that counter, waiting to be served. A woman came to the counter and said, "What do you want?" And Frank said, "I'd like to see Con Margellis, please." That lady then walked behind the counter out of sight to where Con's office was. Con then came to the counter, and even though he hadn't seen Frank for a number of months because they'd become estranged, he greeted Frank with a cheery hello. It was at that point that Frank pulled a gun that he'd hidden underneath his jacket out, pointed it at Con, and pulled the trigger almost immediately. It misfired, didn't go off. Con said, "You've got to be joking," and then fled, along with the 4 or 5 other people that were on that floor at the time that had heard the commotion.
My partner and myself were acting as 503, which is the afternoon car for the City of Melbourne. Therefore, any crime in Melbourne comes to us.
I want media liaison advised for all people in buildings in Queen Street to keep away from the shop windows, please. We've got people spooking out the windows.
We got a call from our D24, which is our police dispatch, and we were just told, "Shots fired in Queen Street, your job." Off we went.
All units to wear flak jackets.
I was inspecting the prisoners at the City Watch House, and I had a portable radio with me, and then a call came over from D24 in relation to an armed robbery at 191 Queen Street. Following that, there was another call to the effect that shots had been fired. So at that stage, I got on the radio to D24 and just advised them that I'd be on the way.
So we moved on real quick, lights and sirens, and we hit the tram tracks in the centre of the street and took off towards Queen Street.
Back at 191 Queen Street, the 5th floor was a scene of chaos. Staff were confronted by a gunman, Frank Vitkovic, who was chasing them around the office to prevent them escaping.
Frank then lifts the gun up, fires it at Con as Con is fleeing away, misses Con, and hits 19-year-old Judy Morris, who was standing in between where Frank was and where Con was fleeing. She became the first victim on level 5.
Con Margellis had taken cover in the toilet, terrified the gunman would track him down. He would ultimately survive the massacre. Vitkovic, meanwhile, unable to find Con, had new targets in his sights.
It became more than just about Con. Frank obviously decided that he was going to die that day. He wanted to kill Con first, couldn't find Con, so he decided that others would have to die.
This was his way of righting this terrible wrong that had been done to him, almost, I suggest, symbolically through this one person. But then, as we know, through as many other people as he could kill, this general anger towards the world and society.
With one person dead on the 5th floor, Frank Vitkovic decided to leave that level and go hunting for more victims. He chose the supposedly secure 12th floor. The entrance to the offices were protected by a security door. However, the procedure that restricted access was fundamentally flawed.
Employee John Dirac got up from his desk, walked, looked through the small window, couldn't see any reason why he shouldn't open the door. The minute that door was opened, Vitkovic levelled his gun at John Dirac and shot him.
John Dirac would survive the shooting at Queen Street. Other workers wouldn't be so fortunate.
Immediately after shooting Dirac, Vitkovic heard 20-year-old Julie McBean scream. He then walked straight towards her and was heard to say at the time, and he was cocking and recocking his gun. That's when he first realised it could only fire one at a time, and he was fiddling with it, and he actually said, "They expect me to kill people with this gun." He then walked up to her and shot her twice, victim number 2. After killing Julie, Frank walked into a partitioned office where David Spencer, 38, was hiding. He was heard to say, "Please no." Vitkovic ignored that, shot him. He then turned and walked out of that office towards 18-year-old Nancy Avignon, who was lying on the floor under her desk, again pleading for her life. He shot her twice from about 3 meters away, wounding her each time. He then walked straight up, put the gun to her head, and finished her off.
With the death toll now at 4, police were beginning to assemble outside on Queen Street.
We were the first to arrive at the scene, the first detectives, and there's a couple of uniforms just getting out of cars. And what we saw was cars were blocked in the street, and there was shots fired from high above in a glass tower.
Meanwhile, workers on other floors in the building were beginning to realise something was terribly wrong.
It wasn't long before someone noticed out the window that there was a car parked across Queen Street and there was police activity out there. There's probably 8 or 9 of us looking out the window thinking, what's going on, what's going on? Well, it was probably only a few minutes after that that we heard on the 12th floor, bang, 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 and then realised, you know, something's on here.
At the same time, Glenn Schilling, who worked on level 14, was heading for the lifts to begin his journey home as shots rang out.
On the way down, I heard several fairly loud bangs. When I got to the ground floor, I went to get out of the lift, and there was a couple of policemen that were taking a bit of shelter behind a couple of pillars.
The police told Schilling to get back in the lift and go back up. There was another person in the lift with Schilling, and that person pressed the lift to the 11th floor. Schilling wouldn't normally have gone to the 11th because he worked on the 14th.
We heard a couple of more bangs, and he got out at the 11th floor. And I thought, what I'll do is that I'll get out on the 11th floor so that I could have a look out the window to see if I could see what was going on. There were several police cars with police officers sheltering behind the cars, just like you would see on television or in the movies.
After shooting Nancy on level 12, Frank made his way down to level 11 via the fire escape.
A colleague came running and said, you better hide because he's coming to this floor. Some people ran with him, and I think they went into the computer room. Some people hid under desks. The noises got louder, and then I heard firearm discharge.
As he walked in through the swinging doors onto level 11, Michael Maguire, 38, married with 3 kids, spotted him, obviously scared, ran into an office.
Michael Maguire had run into the very office where Glenn Schilling was observing the mounting chaos on the street below.
It was then that I had the oh shit moment where I thought, now I know what's going on.
The gunman came running up the aisles, and all the time he was discharging the firearm. It sounded automatic, but sometimes it would stall, and then he would swear and say, you know, you're all going to die. Where's the police? Why aren't they here? I'm going to kill you all that sort of stuff.
Unfortunately, the gunman had seen Michael Maguire and shot him once. I had jumped under a desk. Michael was pleading for his life. He was saying, please don't shoot me. I decided the best course of action was just to stay hidden and hope that he wasn't aware that I was there. He then walked back to Michael, who was still in great distress, and He just walked over and held the gun barrel about an inch away from Michael's scalp and shot him again. The gunman walked out and I heard Michael's last couple of breaths, and then he was silent.
5 people now lay dead in the building, with several more severely wounded and in desperate need of medical attention. With police still outside, the death toll was set to rise again. In the heart of Melbourne, a gunman was out of control, stalking the floors of a Queen Street office block. By now, 5 people had been killed and many more injured. The shooting had only been going on for a matter of minutes, but already police were surrounding the building.
We'd ordered the SWAT team some 3 minutes earlier and we were told they were 15 minutes away. And I remember saying, 15 minutes? Fuck that, it can't be 15 minutes.
What we didn't know was how many offenders there were, because there were calls coming through to D24 saying that a person was on the 5th floor, on the 12th floor, on the 11th floor. There were shots being fired, and because it was such a fluid scene, we weren't able to confirm whether there was 1 or 2 or more offenders. We were still acting on the basis of the fact it was an armed robbery and considered the fact it was an armed robbery had gone wrong, and that's why the shots had been fired.
Tragically, robbery was the last thing on Vitkovic's mind.
Vitkovic walked across level 11, firing at random, saying, "You're all scum." He spotted Don McElroy in a corner, fired, hitting him once. Don McElroy then fell against the window, a floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Queen Street, and smashed that window. Vitkovic then walked away for about another minute, again firing random shots. McElroy was screaming in pain. Vitkovic walked up to him and said, "You're giving me a lot of trouble, fat man," and shot McElroy again. McElroy survived. His next victim was Marianne Van Eyck, 38. She was quivering with fright, obviously scared. Vitkovic walked up to her and said, "Don't worry, I'm going to put you out of your misery," held the gun to her head, fired once, making her victim number 6. Catherine Dowling and Rosemary Spiteri were also hiding under their desks on level 11. Vitkovic started firing at them, hit Kathy, killed her, wounded Rosemary. He then went up to Rosemary at close range and shot her in the neck. She survived. Catherine didn't. At this point, Vitkovic spotted Frank Carmody.
Well, I was looking for an opportunity. I was praying to God to give me that opportunity. It just sort of happened. Like he said, this gun is jamming, so I thought, this is it, go for it, man. I didn't pre-think it or anything. I'm no hero. It's just a matter of survival. That's what it was, survival.
Frank went for him, and I don't think he was able to get on top of him, so the gunman shrugged him off and actually shot him.
I felt this burning sensation go through me, It didn't sort of super hurt, but it was just a burning sensation.
After wounding Carmody, Vitkovic walked over to Rod Brown, shot him dead. Rod Brown became victim number 8. Tony Joya was hiding at this stage, saw Rod Brown get murdered, and Tony was convinced that he was going to be next.
I thought he had his back to me then, and at that moment I decided to jump him. We wrestled, and I think we both fell on top of Frank, maybe, and I think somebody took the gun off him. Another lady came out of her hiding place, took the gun off them.
She had it off and hid it in the fridge.
We were grappling with the gunman. I think I was on top of him, Frank was next to me, and Don and McElroy and Claire Chalkley sort of sat on him.
Imagine this, they're on the floor, they've got the gun away from him, but Vitkovic is desperate, he's crawling towards the broken window and he's trying to shake these people off. It's at this point that Vitkowic's obviously decided, I haven't got the gun anymore, I can't shoot myself, which was probably his intention. He's lost that option, he sees the window and he's obviously decided to hurl himself to his death.
He was fighting hard, he was trying to get away and wasn't saying anything. Just, muffles and groans and things like that. There was no words.
He's a big bloke, he's crawling along, he crawls through the broken window, cuts his stomach and head shockingly, bleeding profusely, and he's trying to kick them off.
I tried to stop him. I had him by his ankles and somebody had hold of me because they were worried that I would go over as well.
And he was actually able to reach a point where his ankles were where the window was broken and the rest of his body was hanging over the balcony, and he desperately wanted to plunge to his death.
On the street, police and witnesses below were observing the chaos on the 11th floor with a sense of confusion.
We thought, it's a victim trying to free himself. And of course you would. Why would you think any different? And we watched this victim for this minute and a half, which again seemed like an hour. And then eventually we saw another person that his hands were hanging onto the victim. So we could see a struggle, and this didn't make sense. Why would an offender be struggling with a victim? And all this was racing through our mind as the adrenaline's pumping, trying to analyse it. And then we saw something extraordinary. The person, mostly out of the window, seemed to fight off his saviour, and then he was free.
And down he went, 11 floors, face down, into the pavement. Police that saw him fall witnessed that body bounce to the height of a car.
There's a man, looks like he's got from into the building with a dead man, looks like on the footpath, and I'm not quite sure. He's right in front of me, please. Stand by.
And I had to step back, quite literally. I had to step back as he fell where I was standing.
The time of his death was recorded by police at 4:34 and 34 seconds, meaning he killed 8 people in less than 17 minutes.
Police on the ground had little time to reflect on this horrific scene. They had to work out who this person, who had fallen to their death just metres from them, actually was. Was it a hostage or the gunman?
Something fell out of his pockets in this impact, and it was a magazine, and it was for a high-powered weapon, and the bullets, the rounds, fell out of the magazine and just rolled away in the sunlight, just rolled away. I kept yelling to myself internally, think it through, work it out. Why have you got somebody here with a magazine and rounds, bullets just fell out of that? It has to be an offender.
After the gunman had gone out the window, Tony was yelling out, they're all dead, Rod's dead, Kathy dead, Marianne's dead. He came over to me and he said, don't die, Frank, don't die.
So we charged in, all the detectives and the uniforms charged in. As soon as we pressed the lift button, the lift opened and there was these crazy victims in there, blood-stained, hair raised, eyes were sort of almost electrified, screaming and coming at us, and they saw us with guns and they balked and yelled and screamed because all they knew was guns, and you couldn't help but understand later on that they probably thought we were offenders with guns.
Immediately news of the massacre was broadcast, anxious relatives went to the inner city building. Some didn't hold back emotions when loved ones emerged unharmed. Others simply couldn't control their anger.
At that point, I was finding it hard to breathe. I knew there was a lot of blood coming out of me. It was dripping down over my face, and my breathing was going. So I knew I'd been hit in the back. So it was just then a matter of waiting. We could hear the police helicopter buzzing around outside. And it wasn't that long before they came in. The ambulance followed, and the ambulance guy sort of put his hand on my shoulder and said, "You'll be all right, mate, you'll be okay." They cut me tie off, and here's another stupid thing to think of. I thought, that's my best time, it's Christian Dior.
Once the lift doors were open and I stepped into this crime scene, it was no doubt the worst I'd ever seen. And I don't think that's an overstatement at all. I remember a woman saying, "He's over there, he's over there." And she was pointing towards the window. So I moved closer and closer to the window. It's a big office building. And then eventually I got to one particular victim and I was yelling, "Where's the offender?" And he said, "He's out there, he's gone out the window, he's gone out the window, singular." And then I confirmed it. How many were there? Just one. Are you sure there's only one? Just one. What did he have? A gun. What sort of a gun? And they said, "It's in the fridge, it's in the fridge." What? The gun's in the fridge. None of this was making sense. Then I turned to the tea room and you could see a big upright refrigerator. So we opened the fridge and there is the assault weapon, the rifle.
This is a city, a society that's never experienced this sort of thing before. And I just stop and think, what more can we do? Young people, 18, 19, 20, just starting out their working life, just shot down like that. I mean, what do you do?
The obvious question to be asked after the massacre was, how did he get that gun? How was he able to have a semi-automatic rifle that was, had it been operating properly, could have fired off 30 shots in a matter of seconds? The truth is, there were no revelations. He was perfectly entitled to it. He was a 22-year-old bloke with no prior history. He applied in the normal way to the licence registry. He presented all the documents. He then went and legitimately bought an M1 carbine semi-automatic capable of firing 30 shots in a matter of seconds, quite legitimately, put a deposit down, went back a week later and bought the gun.
With the immediate danger over, the police's job changed from hostage rescue to detection. Their key task was to identify who the gunman was and why he decided to carry out the atrocity. In December 1987, an army of police, legal and mental health experts began to gather. They were tasked with determining why 22-year-old Frank Vitkovic had killed 8 people before throwing himself off the 11th floor of a Melbourne office block. The survivors of the massacre, meanwhile, faced their own demons.
I just kind of couldn't come to grips with the fact that it had happened and that it was something that I could immediately talk about, and at that stage I had no idea what was going to happen next.
I don't think I believed he was coming home until he walked in the door. When he walked in the door, he didn't look like Glenn. He stank. The smell of fear. I never believed you could smell fear. He absolutely stank. I've never smelled anything like it, and I never want to smell it again. That night, Glenn didn't speak much at all. He was very zombie-ish. After my parents had gone home, he started to speak to me, but he spoke in a monotone, and it was like a robot talking to me, and he just spoke the whole incident through.
On the evening of the incident, I don't think I slept at all. I can't really remember, but I don't recall nodding off at all. And I got up the next morning and I thought, well, I should go to the doctor. And I really didn't know why I was going to the doctor, because he couldn't do anything, but I figured that's the place you should head. So I went to the doctor and I just howled the whole time I was there, and I said to him, I'm crying my eyes out, but I really don't know why.
It was devastating. We all knew each other, we all, socialised with each other, and I mean, the initial time that I was in hospital, it was unbelievable. You just couldn't grasp that this was real and that you wouldn't see these people again, It was just unbelievable.
In the weeks afterwards, I spent most of my time home. I don't think I went out. And my family shielded me from various people who wanted to talk to me, mostly from the media. But I did see some people from senior management Australia Post, and also some psychologists. Mark Creamer was one of those people that I saw.
In this kind of incident, some of the most difficult things that people have to confront are being very close to the death and suffering of others and seeing somebody else, in this case, being shot or killed, and often in a prolonged and somewhat sadistic kind of way. So that's very difficult. And another part that's extremely difficult is where there's a moral complexity in terms of one's behaviour. How do I decide what to do in this situation? And the kind of factors that determine whether you perhaps try and run away, or whether you try and fight the assailant, or whether you hide. These are very, very difficult decisions to make in that moment, and often afterwards can lead to a whole series of problems. In this case, we had a group of people in a city office block. The last thing they could possibly ever conceive of happening was a gunman coming into their workplace, a safe environment, and killing them, their colleagues and friends.
Detectives investigating the shooting were beginning to realise that the situation that developed on Queen Street could actually have been far worse.
Because of the amount of ammunition that Vitkovic had with him, it could have been much worse because of the fact it was in a confined space. But to a degree, what reduced the number of victims was the fact that the alterations Vitkovic had made to the firearm actually made it work as a single shot more so than an automatic. But had he not done that and had the spring on the trigger mechanism or the bolt actually work smoothly, he would have been able to injure or kill a lot more people.
Despite being a semi-automatic, Vitkovic's gun was faulty, meaning he had to load each bullet manually, something he struggled to do. Many witnesses told of him constantly fiddling with the weapon as he prowled the floors of the building. Nevertheless, he still managed to fire over 40 rounds during the killing spree.
Not only did he not have a weapon that wasn't operating properly, but he wasn't familiar with it either, and he wasn't even doing it as a single shot, so it became a single shot instead of a repeat semi-automatic. Once he'd failed to get Con, he was obviously not going to stop until somebody stopped him. Either the police, which was probably his intention. He would have just kept shooting people, Heaven knows how many more there would have been had that gun operated correctly.
Desperate to uncover the gunman's motivations, police visited Vitkovic's home in Preston. They went to quite extraordinary lengths, literally throwing evidence out of one of the windows.
They then said, is it okay if we search Frank's room? And they got permission to do so. Didn't have a search warrant. Very quickly they found Frank's very extensive, many-page diary. This was a vital piece of evidence. It goes to the heart of why he did it.
The diaries were classic diaries. They were writings of a person, but these writings were dark. These writings probably were a great indication of what was to come.
It was basically his mission spelled out in this diary. They then overheard that the family were a bit concerned that maybe they shouldn't have let them in there without a search warrant, and they actually picked up the phone and they were starting to ring the family lawyer. They put the diary and some other items in 2 plastic bags, threw the bags out of Vitkovic's bedroom window, then went and had a bit more chat to the family and then left, and came back later and went round the side of the house, got those bags and took them. And gee, whilst I'm not condoning police breaking the law, because they did steal that diary, they fetched up to the coroner, told the coroner what he'd done. The coroner was a bit upset but took no further action because the coroner was convinced, like them, that this really was a vital piece of evidence.
It's very clear from the diaries that Frank Vitkovic was a very disturbed young man. He had a chronic knee injury and was very isolated, so he wasn't able to partake in the activities he used to. He became very depressed, a kind of agitated depression, and he started to ruminate excessively about things that had happened to him and the way the world had treated him and the way individuals had treated him. He gradually became more and more angry, more and more obsessed with the idea of revenge against the world and against individuals who had hurt him.
The diary was incredibly important because it was basically what he intended to do, how he intended to do it, and what drove him to do it. Had they not had that diary, it would have been a mystery. People today would be saying, what drove him to that? We now know what drove him to it because of that diary.
I don't think there's any doubt that if we had had access to those diaries prior to the shootings, that would have been a very, very powerful warning sign. I think that there's enough information in those diaries to warrant a significant intervention to try and prevent this happening.
With the questions over the killer's motivations seemingly answered, the inquest that followed the massacre shone an uncomfortable light on the actions of the police that day, with claims that they waited too long before entering the building.
If there was criticisms about how long it took for us to get to the 11th floor and to lend assistance, then I accept those criticisms. It is one of the most horrific crime scenes you could ever imagine. And the most important thing for me as the first detective on the scene was to assess everything and get information back to our control room, and that will then get the appropriate resources running towards that crime scene, driving towards that crime scene. And if I'm criticised for that, I'll take the criticism.
Even now, years later, it is still hard to believe that at 4 o'clock on a December afternoon in 1987, the building on Queen Street in Melbourne became the setting for an unthinkable act of violence.
What happened on December the 8th, 1987 certainly changed my life and my family's life forever. It's been 30 years since, but the incident might as well have been yesterday.
The Queen Street incident changed Glenn forever. He doesn't talk about it at all. It is never mentioned in this house. I could count on one hand the number of times Queen Street has been discussed in this house in the last 30 years. It's just never mentioned.
I look at it from a positive point of view. That is that I had 30 years bonus in my life. I've seen my children grow up, get married, have their own children, and forever thankful that I survived.
What happened on Queen Street that day has just totally affected my life. The emphasis on having, you know, the big job, plenty of money, flash cars, that was sort of put in the background, and the fact of, you know, having your life, having a family, and being able to be at home with them there, watch your kids grow up, all these things were just number one.
The reaction from Victorians following the Queen Street massacre was one of just shock, in that it must be remembered that there hadn't been a mass shooting for decades, almost as far back as anybody can remember, and yet within the space of a few short months you had Julian Knight, a failed army Duntroon student who went crazy in Hoddle Street and shot dead 7 people. 4 months later you've got Vitkovic doing the same and killing 8 people, and people were thinking, is this the new norm? Is this what life in Melbourne is going to be like from now on? And remember, this is before terror incidents were the norm.
It still resonates today. Everybody knows about the Queen Street. We don't have to mention that it was Australia Post or it was a bank building. The fact it was Queen Street conjures up all sorts of horrible memories. 30 years later, it's still one of the worst crimes Melbourne's ever suffered. And I would put it up there with probably one of the worst in Australia.